Hi everyone, welcome back to class. It's week 12 now. We're almost done, y'all. So last class, we didn't have a lecture video, but I did ask you all to watch a documentary, Moving Mountains, the story of Yumian. On top of that, I asked you to review the 8 questions in regard to the documentary. So if you haven't submitted that yet, please reach out and we can see what we can do to make up for this assignment. Okay. I also uploaded the Yumian and Hmong American PowerPoint presentation last week. So if you haven't done yet, please take a look at that PowerPoint presentation. So next week, you do have your second midterm. This time, I'm not going to give you all a 1 week break to put together your study guide. I have your study guide for midterm number 2. Since it is only 3 sections, 3 Asian American groups, I want you all to use this week to also gather all the information from the past couple of lectures, okay? Also, I'm going to, instead of doing a weekly forum this week, I'm going to ask you to take a look at what you want to choose as your final project. Again, you have the 2 options, either doing the children's book or if you want to write an essay. So I'm going to put that in assignment section. You can take a look and I'll give you about this week and next week to select, okay? If you have any questions about that, please reach out to me and I can answer any of your questions, okay? Also, good job on all the submissions for the oral history project. I only have a few students who haven't submitted their oral history project yet. So if you haven't done so, please reach out to me. It's been more than a week already since the submission date or the due date. Please reach out if you haven't done so yet, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and begin. So some of the very first group of Cambodian Americans were actually students going to CSU Long Beach. So similar to the pensionado program with the Philippine Americans, the Cambodian government and U.S. government had a agreement where they were allowed to have a group of intelligent students come to the United States and receive a degree. And they could come back to Cambodia or they could stay in the United States. So this program occurred between 1950 into 1960s. So a lot of Cambodian immigrants came to CSU Long Beach, studied, and returned back to Cambodia, while there was many Cambodian immigrants who actually stayed. And I'll explain also a little bit down this lecture what they played a role in the history of Cambodian American immigrants. Now Cambodia, so prior to the Cold War, so prior to 1950s, it was controlled by the French, and they had a very strong political influence among Cambodia. Usually, the French were the ones who chose who was next in line, who was a king and controlled Cambodia. So, think about it this way. The king or the ruler of Cambodia was usually a puppet for the French. Usually the king would have to discuss with the French and whoever was in charge, and that would go. And that happened for many years. And in return, the French protected Cambodia. So it was like a two-way street for the two. Then in 1940, the next king to come up was a young Norodom Sihanouk. And at the time, he was 19 years old. And the French believed this was very good since whatever they would say, they believed that Norodom would be able just to listen. So it would be easy to manipulate him. Now, during World War II, so entering the 1940s, there was a lot of Japanese troops coming to Cambodia. Now, all of the French were starting to move back to France because of the Vichy Agreement. And the Vichy Agreement was between Japan and France, where Japanese troops were allowed to be stationed throughout Cambodia. And so there was less French control but more Japanese throughout the country. But after World War II, after all the Japanese troops left, France wanted to come back and recolonize Cambodia. Um, so this was post 1945, but Cambodia, throughout its history, never really had its independence. It didn't get their independence until 1954, and they eventually do, but it took some time. At the time, it was still King Norodom Sihanouk who was still in control as king. Throughout the 1950s, during the Cold War, King Norodom Sihanouk tried to remain neutral. Now, he cut off ties between the United States, but he wanted to maintain relations with China. And this was because he didn't want the country to go back into war. They just left, the world. Many countries just exited World War II, and because of Cambodia, it was it's a third world country, and it didn't want to enter another war, and it didn't want to lose more people, and so he didn't. Cambodia and King Norodom Sihanouk didn't want to jump into another war and lose more people. So he tried staying neutral, and they believed that with the help of China, they'd be able to flourish. And in Cambodia, though, there were smaller groups of communists developing throughout the country. One of the most radical groups was led by a Salat Star. He later on changed his name and is known as Pol Pot. So Pol Pot eventually overthrew King Norodom while he was away on a trip. So a coup happened while King Norodom Sihanouk was out of the country. And what Pol Pot wanted to do was to transform all of Cambodian society. He wanted to be the way he believed Cambodia should be. And now this is where the Khmer Rouge occurred. And what the Khmer Rouge was a complete equal society, which although forced everyone back to their quote-unquote ancestral village. So everyone that was living in the city were forced back to their provinces or their village where they came from. It included even the elderly and the sick that were that were in the hospitals, and then they would have to either force themselves to get up or they were to be carried back to where they came from. And religion, individualism, any traces of any type of institution that connected back to the French was banned. And if you were caught, you were killed basically. So this was known as New Era as Year Zero, and everyone who was sent back was they were put into work in the fields, so any type of agricultural labor, and everyone would sell any type what they were growing. So this idea would be to finance how the future would work. So they would develop money that way, selling and exporting, and gaining all that money for the country. Anyone who disobeyed any law, so if they didn't want to work in the fields, or again, if they were practicing their own religion or doing anything modern at the time and not the way that Pol Pot wanted, they would be killed. Anything that's relating to, again, the modern era, so education, colleges, books, money, banks, modern Western medicine, it was not allowed. And it unfortunately led to young children being brainwashed to thinking that what Pol Pot is doing is right, and that they would have to um, tell an officer or anyone related to or in connection with Pol Pot, um, if anyone was doing anything illegal, that they would tell them, and they would they would be killed. But they won't tell the children to be killed. So the entire country were basically slaves. They would plant, harvest, build dams, and levees, everything by hand, no technology. Citizens were only given a bowl of thin gruel. So it was no protein at all. It was just carbs, just rice. And that was the only thing that a lot of the people were living off of. Now, they could only eat what the officers were giving the people, but if they were caught fishing or eating any type of animals or plants that were not part of what was given by the soldiers, they would be punished. They would be sent to jail or they'd be killed. If there were any other outside ethnic groups, they would be persecuted. So there was the Vietnamese and Cambodia were actually seen as enemies, and any ethnic Vietnamese would be immediately killed or um, be be put into jail. So here are some images of some Cambodians fleeing. So a lot of them were trying to flee from the Khmer Rouge, but unfortunately many of them were caught. They would try to cross the border into another country. Here's another image of a lot of Cambodians working agriculture. So they're creating a lot of these bridges, trying to develop the land to make it usable for agriculture. Now, here was a school that was actually transformed into a prison. Now, a lot of these windows here were actually were changed into bars. And here are a lot of images of Cambodians who were in prison. So there were a lot of elderly men and women, and then even young children too. So there was thousands of those who were in prison and put into these schools. And here's some more images of young children getting in line to get lunch. They're all holding their pants to get a grill. Now, the first official group of Cambodian American immigrants coming to the United States came in around the mid 1970s. At the time, President Gerald Ford set up an interagency task force to manage the amount of refugees coming out of the country. There was 130,000 spots for refugees in Southeast Asia. So it was a various group of immigrants actually from Southeast Asia. And 4,600 were Cambodians. And in the Khmer Republic Air Force, the pilots there flew themselves and their family out of Cambodia. So they were lucky because they were able to fly themselves out, unlike many of the other ones who had to wait in order to get out of the country. There were also Khmer Republic Navy personnel who were able to drive their boats or ships out of international waters. The people who were also diplomats in the country were able to escape the Khmer Rouge. The United States, they offered airlift to government officials, military commanders, and other Cambodians who work with the U.S. So like those U.S. ambassadors, those who were very close with the U.S. government were able to escape. But a lot of the Cambodians who were offered to escape the country refused because they believed that the country would go back to how it was before but it would take many years before this would happen. So only 900 accepted the offer to escape the country. Now, the second wave of Cambodian Americans consisted of majority of refugees, and they escaped and made it through Thailand during the Khmer Rouge. So they escaped to actually different countries around Cambodia, and they were able to make their way to the United States. Around 9,000 Cambodian refugees were brought to the United States under the authority of the U.S. Attorney General Griffin Boyette Bell in 1978. So close to almost 10 years after the first wave was the second wave of Cambodian immigrant refugees. And this time it was twice as much as before. Unfortunately, during the time in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge massacred and launched raids along the Cambodian Vietnamese border. Within this 3-year span, they were just killing any Cambodian who was trying to escape the country. Vietnam tried to settle an agreement with Cambodia, but failed. Reason why Vietnam tried to stop it was because a lot of the villages within the border were getting attacked too. So a lot of Vietnamese citizens were getting killed along with the Cambodian refugees. And then afterwards, in 1979, the Vietnamese troops invaded Cambodia and captured Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge were almost immediately defeated. Okay, so within a week span, they were defeated, and the Vietnamese troops controlled Phnom Penh. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge retreated back into the jungle, trying to escape this. And then the Vietnamese troops actually maintained control within Cambodia for a good amount of time. So from 1979 to 1989, the Vietnamese troops and government were actually present. Now, the third wave. Now, during this time, since there was no more Khmer Rouge, Cambodian citizens believed there was no need to flee. It was just now trying to find family members who they were separated with. Now, that was a priority, so they would either immigrate to neighboring countries or move to neighboring countries. And some knew that a lot of their family members immigrate to the United States. So that's what happened. So between 1980 and 1984, around 70,189 Cambodian immigrants came to the United States. Now, there was a good amount of Cambodian immigrants coming to the United States, but the numbers started to go down. So, taking a look here, from 1985 to 1986, only 19,921 came in, and that number dropped even more between 1987 and 1990. There's only 11,843 refugees came in. Now, the large settlement of Cambodians actually live in Long Beach today, or nearby Los Angeles. Again, this was because there's a large group of those students who came into the country. A lot of them were settled in CSU Long Beach, and a lot of the students offered assistance to a lot of the refugees coming in. The next closest group of, or the next city with the second largest population of Cambodians is actually here in Stockton, California. So it's roughly about an hour, a little bit more than an hour from San Jose. And then goes from there, it goes Texas, Pennsylvania, New York, Minnesota, and Illinois. So those are the other countries. But again, California has the largest Cambodian and, in general, Asian population. Similar to the other Asian American immigrants, The Cambodian community were able to develop their own little community known as Little Phnom Penh. And this community was first developed with the first wave of Cambodian refugees that came to the United States. And it was with the help of a lot of those Cambodian students at CUCU Long Beach that they were able to navigate through U.S. society. Um, the Cambodian students showed a lot of these refugees about mental health places that they go to. So, because a lot of refugees were experiencing PTSD, and so this was a good way for them to talk it out. But although a lot of them refused to seek mental health, um, the students were able to help them navigate through U.S. society. So, being able to find jobs, how to find where to eat, um, living situations, and so on. And throughout the years, this led to many Cambodian businesses and restaurants to open up. So grocery stores, anything for the community. And moving forward, this was a way for Cambodian refugees to move on. It took a really long time for them to rebuild, but it was a way for them to, a lot of them, to help their children have a better future. A lot of the jobs they took on didn't require a lot of English, which was because a lot of groceries and restaurants and businesses were now Cambodian owned in Little Phnom Penh. They were able to find cheap and affordable properties, but it was a lot of struggle for them, and they wanted their children though to get as much education as they can, but a lot of the students had to drop out of high school to be able to provide, but they also wanted their children to have a good education, so it was trying the best to help support the family. And this is where one of the challenges for many Cambodian refugees occurred, because it was hard to try to get an education because family needed financial assistance. So a lot of students, young students, would drop out just to work. And unfortunately, over half of the Cambodian Americans in California had less than a high school education, and only 9% have a college degree. And that's because of various factors that play a role in this. A lot has to do with traditional gender responsibilities, familial responsibilities, like in finance, and language barriers, especially since this was just a very recent group of refugees coming in. A lot of the refugees were still trying to learn English. On top of that, the mental health issues that a lot of these recent refugees were experiencing. Like I mentioned before, a lot of the elders were experiencing PTSD and depression that occurred from the Khmer Rouge. And in this image here, I just want to show the population of Cambodians living in poverty in 2015. So this was almost 30 years after the first set of refugees coming in. And these are a very recent group of refugees, and there were a lot of them. A lot of the refugees are very traditional, and a lot of the various factors, social factors, are affecting Cambodians from moving upwards. So here we see in the dark green here is the all of Americans living in poverty. So close to 20%. Those who, all of them, and then the U.S. born and the foreign born ones. And then we have all Asians right in the middle, and then the Cambodian group. Notice that all Cambodians in the all section here are all living in poverty compared to, there's a higher number of Cambodian Americans in poverty than the U.S. and all of Asians. And those who are U.S. born, it's very high percentage. And in the English proficiency of Cambodians are shown here. So those who are U.S. born obviously have a higher English proficiency than those who are foreign born. Only a little bit more than half of Cambodian adults are proficient in English. And a lot of those living in Southern California, again, those living in Little Phnom Penh, don't really need to speak English. And it's because a lot of the businesses and restaurants there, the people living there and the owners mostly speak Cambodian. It's a Cambodian language. There's been a lot of positive changes in the Cambodian American communities. There's been a lot of various organizations to help Cambodian Americans, such as the Cambodian American Resource Agency, or CARA, and Student Unite Khmer communities. Cambodia Tomorrow is a Christian education for Cambodian Americans. Khmer Girls in Action. It's to teach social justice values, and it advocated for women's rights. So this was this is something pretty important, because now it's showing that Cambodian women are also able to do anything that men can do. And there's a Homeland Cultural Center. This was a community center that provided various types of activities and services for the community. So this allowed to help Cambodians find jobs. They even taught a little bit of English classes there too. So this was to help them navigate through society also. And there's Neighboring Services Bureau, which provides language classes to the community also. So again, this is another organization that would help teach English to Cambodians. Now next week is midterm number 2. Again, it's going to be following how midterm number 1 was. I'm going to give you 1 week or 5 days from Monday to the midterm's going to be open from Monday until Friday of next week, and you will have an hour and a half to complete the midterm. So midterm number 1's been graded. I want you to review that, and then now midterm number 2. Okay. If you have any questions about midterm number 2, email me or jump into office hours. All right. If you have any questions, let me know. You all have a great week.